Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm Osman Bart, video producer. My guest today is Tahrir Hamdi. Tahrir Hamdi has written a book that we're going to be discussing today, which is called Imagining Palestine. She is a professor of an anti-colonial and resistance literature and is currently the rector at Arab Open University, Jordan. Her book entitled Imagining Palestine, Culture and Exile and National Identity was published by Bloomberg in December 2022. She is also co-editing a book with Louis Bronhay on Ghassan Kanfani. This always happens in the bio section, I have to apologize. Revolutionary Political and Theoretical Essays, which will be published by Pluto Press in 2024. She won the prestigious Abdul Hamid Shoman Foundation Prize in 2020 for the best researcher in the Arab world in the humanities. She is also assistant editor of the journal Arab Studies Quartetly, which was founded by Edward Said and Ibrahim Abu Lord in 1979. I really should have done a practice on this before I started. She is also an associate editor of the new journal, Janus Unbound. Her research revolves around resistance literature, anti-colonial theory, and the importance of place and space in literature. She has published articles on Edward Said, William Butler Yeats, Mahmoud Darwish, Mourid Barghouti, Saadi Youssef, Hassan Kanafi, Naji al-Ali, Palestine, Ireland, and Iraq. Her current research interests include decolonization of education in the global south, the complexity of place and space, historical, temporal, geographical, and imaginative within the anti-colonial resistance spheres. Tahrir, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you very much, Osman. That's how you pronounce your name,
yes,
right?
Yes, it's our pleasure.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here. But I just want to say that the book, Imagining Palestine, was published by Bloomsbury. You said Bloomsburg. It's Bloomsbury.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
I like the fact that, you see, I have to prove that I'm not just particular to one culture. I mispronounce words and names across every culture and language.
It's okay. That's
it's about equality.
I'm pretty sure if I was pronouncing names from other cultures, I do the
same. Yeah. I know. It's always names for some reason get me. I'm good with everything else but names. Right. But anyway, so thank you for writing this book. It was a very interesting one to read. We're going to be publishing a review of it in Middle East Monitor. And you are also being shortlisted for the Palestine Book Awards. Mm-hmm. So we've got that coming up, which is Middle East Monitor. We'll have that at I believe, later this year.
Yeah.
But I wonder if we could sort of go back to the beginning, and perhaps you could tell us, this book, Imagining Palestine, why did you decide to write this book?
Well, Osman, there are many reasons for that. It's not just one thing. Well, first of all, I can start on a personal level. My father, Tahrir Hamdi, was one of the founders of the Arab nationalist movement in the 50s in Jordan here. And the way he brought us up, he was always talking about Palestine. Palestine was at the dinner table. Palestine was in our conversations, even when we were playing, etc. So I grew up myself, imagining Palestine, imagining what Palestine is going to be, past, present, and future. I wanted to write a book that combines many elements, many dimensions. That is not just the historical. I wanted to write about the historical and the political and the ideological and the cultural and the literary. I wanted to write about art and music and dance, and I wanted to include the national and the personal as well. because I just felt there was no book out there that sort of combined all of these elements. And I think that Palestine and the Palestinian cause deserves this kind of, let's say, combination or integration of elements, because you cannot define it only historically or politically or culturally or, in separate elements. That's another thing. Another very important element is because you have to admit, and I think the world needs to admit, that in Palestine, you have this ethical, moral scandal, okay? A people was dispossessed in 1948. We should talk about even the diction that we use, Osman. We should never say, and I find many Arab writers as well, not only Western writers, but Arab and Muslim writers will say something like the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but it's not a conflict. It is not a conflict. A conflict means you have two equal sides, two countries, two nations at war, and you're either on this side or that side. Israel is a settler colonial entity. Israel came into existence by erasing, dispossessing a people called the Palestinian people, the indigenous inhabitants of the land. So I think that this needs to be clarified, not only to the West, but also to the Arab world. Many Arab writers still say Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And even, the importance, Osman, of diction, I think it's really important. What you say, for example, there's a term that is always used, and even by Palestinian writers, they will say Israel hyphen Palestine or Palestine hyphen Israel. No, you cannot equate the two. In Israel, you have a brutal, apartheid, racist settler colony. What is Palestine? Palestine represents historical Palestine, and the Palestinians are the indigenous people of the land that were displaced, dispossessed. So diction is very important. The Palestinian poet, Mourid Barghouti, for example, he said that this use of words or the wrong use of terminology in diction, he called it verbicide. Okay, and verbicide, you can think about it in terms of ethnocide, memoricide, like memoricide is the erasure of memory, genocide, because verbicide and memoricide can lead to genocide and has in many cases led to genocide. So this is one aspect of why I wanted to write this book. But also, I believe, Osman, that there is a real concrete hope that Palestine will indeed be liberated one day, okay? And one day soon, because the resilience of the Palestinian people is, I think, legendary, is iconic, okay? So I wanted to combine these two elements. I wanted to keep the conversation on Palestine going. At the same time, I wanted a book that was empowering, that empowers people, okay? So all of these elements, if you combine them, I would say is why I wanted to write this book, why I wrote this book. I don't know if this is good enough of an answer. What do you think?
It's a very good answer, a very strong answer.
Thank
Just
you.
to follow up as well, I mean, you've also, the way you've constructed the book is you're following a series of different writers, artists, thinkers, Palestinian intelligentsia. And I'm sort of just wondering, just on a technical level, why did you select the writers you did and how did you select them?
Okay, now the writers that I selected are mostly Palestinian. This is true. But others are not. Okay, for example, Radwa Ashur is an Egyptian writer, and I did discuss her book Tantura, The Woman from Tantura, which was a Palestinian village. And I think in Tantura there was a massacre of young men and boys. So it's not just Palestinian writers, there are Arab writers, there are also indigenous writers, Native American writers, and indigenous writers, First Nation writers from Canada, African American writers as well. Why did I choose this? I mean, some of them are theorists, some of them are critics, some of them are artists, singers, intellectuals, but they all share one thing, Rasman. For me, they share this refusal to surrender, this defiance, this belief in resistance in all its forms. Okay, we can say cultural resistance, in the resistance through literature, through poetry, novels, dance. Even the Dabke dance, for example, can become a form of resistance, especially when they're doing the Dabke, in Gaza, and the Israelis are like bombing them from above and from land, air, and everywhere. So these people, these intellectuals share this belief in resistance, in a refusal to surrender, defiance, sumud. Sumud in Arabic, it's in English, it means steadfastness. Okay. So all of these writers, intellectuals, singers, dancers, what have you, they refuse defeatism. Okay, they refuse the concept of defeat or the defeatist mentality. You may ask, well, what do you mean by the defeatist mentality? I'll tell you. You didn't ask, but I'm going to answer anyway. What I mean by defeatism is what the Palestinian Authority is doing now, what many Arab regimes are doing now. A belief in that Palestine, all of Palestine, from the river to the sea, cannot be liberated. They'll tell you, oh, that's an idealistic, that's utopian. That's never going to happen. So let's make do with what we have, little pieces of land, or what is left of quote unquote West Bank. Even the use of the word West Bank is a form of verbicide, because it is not the West Bank, it's the eastern part of Palestine. Okay, so for me, it is defeatist not to believe in resistance, not to believe in victory, not to be able to imagine victory, not to be able to imagine Palestine, all of Palestine. So these writers share my concept of what Palestine is or what Palestine will be. Okay, so I can, for example, Bell Hooks is an African American writer, and I just like to read you. I don't know how much time I have, okay?
You have all the time you
But
need.
all right. Bell Hooks is an African American theorist critic, and in order to explain what she means by the margin, and the margin being, let's say, a site of resistance, Osman, she invites her reader to enter the margin. Now, you may think margin, that's marginal and that's weak, but no. The margin represents the refugee camps. The margin represents the margins of society. The margin represents the ghettos in the UK, in the US, all over the world. But these spaces of oppression, where oppressed people have been, let's say, pushed into, okay, and for the Palestinian people, we're talking about 75 years of refugee camps, okay? Look at what she says. This is Bell Hooks. She says, this is an intervention, a message from that space in the margin that is a site of creativity and power, that inclusive space where we recover ourselves, where we move in solidarity to erase the category colonized, colonizer, marginality as site of resistance. Enter that space. She's inviting you, Usman, and all the readers to enter that space. Let us meet there. Enter that space. We greet you as liberators. So I think this is what all the people that I chose share. We're talking about Edward Said. Edward Said, the theorist, the great Palestinian intellectual who interrogated colonial discourse. And he ushered in a new form of thinking, a new discipline. He talked about the margin. He talked about the intellectual who must always choose that margin with the oppressed. Also in my book, I talk about Mahmoud Darwish. Of course, I mentioned Edward Said, and for Edward Said, the intellectual lives in exile, not necessarily, I should say, not necessarily a physical exile. Edward Said was in exile. He was in a physical exile. But at the same time, it is even more important for the intellectual to live in a mental or metaphorical exile, to be uncomfortable, to be restless, to always be asking questions, to always be interrogating. For Mahmoud Darwish, for example, in his poem Counterpoint, in Arabic it's called Tibaq, and he wrote it in tribute to Edward Said. What does Darwish? Darwish is a very popular Palestinian poet. He's the national poet of Palestine. He says, exile is the world outside. Exile is the world inside. Okay? So exile can be physical, but exile is also mental, psychological, and metaphorical. So these people, Najil Ali, the cartoonist, if you read the book, you will see I chose some, certain cartoons by Najil Ali, a fierce, defiant thinker, resistor, artist. In one of his cartoons, he has this man with an open shirt, right? And on this side and on this side of his shirt are the names of Palestinian refugee camps. Okay, and underneath the drawing in the caption, it says no reconciliation, no negotiations, no recognition. So you can see this form of extreme defiance. You may ask yourself, where do these thinkers get their extreme defiance? Even, if you look at the new generations in Palestine, some of these young men and women who defy to the point of martyrdom, okay? Where does this kind of defiance and resistance, where does it come from? Well, if you have a brutal settler colony, such as Israel, it represents what? The consummate negativity, okay? And when you have an extreme form of negativity, what does that breed? What does it breed? It breeds its opposite, its mirror opposite, and that is an extreme form of resistance. That's what my book is about. This is what imagining Palestine means. It's about empowerment. I hope that people who read the book will understand that I mean to empower. And when I say imagine, I don't mean something that is imaginary. No, this is something that will be realized. Maybe I spoke too much, but I think you know what I mean when because I'm talking about different peoples and different people, different thinkers, and different disciplines, but they all share this idea of defiance and resistance and never surrendering, etc.
Yes, that was actually going to be what I was going to come on to next, the actual word imagining, because of course, as you have just alluded to, the fact is the word imagining, a lot of people think of the word imagining as in not there, fictional. But this is not what you're talking about here. There's actually from the book a number of layers in which you think about imagination. So I'm wondering if you could talk us through a little bit of those layers and, what the political functionality of them are.
Okay. I want to begin by reading to you a very short quotation by the poet Mourid Barghouti, okay, because it's about imagining itself. And as you said, there are many different layers, but okay, when we get to beginnings, because I want to talk about beginnings as well. But let me read this quotation by Mourid Barghouti. He says the following, and this is what I open my book with, by the way. Okay. But I tell myself, No reality cancels out imagination. Reality waylays us quickly, but gives rise in the mind to further imagining. I come close to asking myself if there is a truth outside the human imagination. For me, imagining, it is a conscious act. It is an intentional act of making something real. Okay. In my book, I say the following, that imagining Palestine is a conscious act of resistance and defiance, which involves the constant process of configurations, reconfigurations, formulations, and reformulations of Palestinian national and cultural collective identity. Okay, so imagining is a process, a conscious process that empowers, that makes real. Okay, and it enables, let's say, the oppressed who has been dehumanized to be able to rehumanize himself, herself, because through imagining, you are empowering, and the oppressed find, is in, let's say, let me put it this way. The oppressed is able to imagine victory, to imagine power, okay? It enables the oppressed to be able to strike the colonizer, to hurt the colonizer, okay? And through this, and of course, Frantz Fanon talked about using, he called it violence. We say armed struggle now. But Frantz Fanon said, for example, that through the use of violence against the colonizer, the oppressed is able to rehumanize himself, herself, because we realize that we do have the power. We do have the power to strike and hurt the colonizer. So the importance of imagining is, as you say, we have several layers. It is theoretical, but it is also practical. It is also on the ground. Okay, so it's also being able to imagine a more just world. It enables us to imagine the outlines of a better world. And what does that mean? A better world is a world where oppression does not exist, where dispossession does not exist, where refugee camps do not exist. People have become accustomed to refugee camps. The Palestinian refugee camps have become almost semi-permanent, okay? But we should never accept that, okay? A refugee camp represents a people in waiting. They are waiting for something to happen. And that something to happen that has not yet been realized is their return to their homeland. So this imagining also is about the not yet achieved, if you know what I mean, okay? But it will be achieved. It is not yet achieved, but we will get there. Yes.
There was also another aspect. I mean, there was, as we said, there's quite a few different aspects to the way imagination works. And part of it, from what I detected in the book as well, is because so many people are no longer living on the land that is theirs, there's a kind of displacement. And so some of the imagination was about creating new memories of what would have been. Well, that's at least part of the resistance idea, that because you have this quote from David Ben Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, where he says, when he was talking about the Palestinians that had, were made refugees by 1948, the Nakba and the expulsion, he says famously, the old will die and the young will forget. This is a very prominent thing. And so the parts of the act of the imagination, in a way, is them not just not forgetting, but also creating new memories of the places they would have been in.
Yeah. So imagining Palestine, you're right there. If I understood your question correctly, Osman, um, you have Palestinians all over the world, right? They're spread all over the world. Most of them, or yeah, many of them on are not living in occupied Palestine. You have many in refugee camps in the Arab world, Lebanon, Jordan, all over the Arab world. You also have, of course, Palestinians in exile in the UK, in the US, in Europe, all over the world. Now, what do they do? Wherever you go, I mean, if you're invited to a Palestinian wedding, you will always find symbols, let's say, of Palestine. You feel that these Palestinians in exile, wherever they are carrying Palestine with them, their Palestine, their imagined Palestine, wherever they go. Okay. They could be in Canada, New York, a refugee camp in Lebanon or in Jordan. Palestine is always there. It is always present. And Palestine can mean different things to different people. Their imagined Palestine. Even when I was growing up, I always imagined what Palestine would be for me, how it would look like, who would be included in this Palestine. So carrying Palestine with us wherever we go, I think is part of what it means to keep Palestine alive, to keep the Palestinian cause alive. And it is very important, I think, in different ways to keep imagining and talking about Palestine. Some people will write, others will sing, others will dance, others will discuss, others, simply to have a conversation with your friend. So we have different imaginings then of Palestine, if this is what I understood, from your question. In terms of David Ben Gurion, that the old will die and the young will forget. Well, let's put it this way. Well, obviously the old did die. That's natural. That's a natural process. But did the young forget? Is this what we see today? I mean, if you go to occupied Palestine, now if you go to Gaza, go to Jenin, go to the Jenin refugee camp, do you feel that the young of Palestine have forgotten? The Nakba continues. It's really hard to forget something that is continuing. The catastrophe is not a one-time event. It did not happen in 1948 and just stop there, because after 1948, you've had massacres, you've had even daily nakbas, right? Inside and outside occupied Palestine. How can the young forget something that is continuing? I don't know if you've heard of these names, but a lot of young Palestinian intellectuals who have now been martyred, like Basil al-Araj. Basil al-Araj was a pharmacist by training, but he was a revolutionary thinker who gathered people. He's in the eastern part of Palestine, or what is called the West Bank. Okay, he had an underground university where he gathered the young people and taught them revolutionary ethics. He was martyred, Basil al-Araj. So was Nizar Banat. These are young Palestinian thinkers who did not forget. Also, the young fighters. Last year, I think it was Ibrahim al-Nabilsi, who fought to the last bullet. Did Basil al-Araj forget? No. Did Nizar Banat forget? Did Ibrahim al-Nabilsi forget? What about the prisoners who escaped from prison, like Mahmoud al-Arda and Zakaria Zbedi? Did they forget? Did I forget? Will my children forget? So, no, Palestine will never be forgotten. The old may die, and they will die, and they have died, but Palestine lives. It's not a matter of trying to keep a memory alive, or even a post memory, because we are living the Nakba every day. The Nakba is the Arabic word, of course, for catastrophe. So the catastrophe is being lived every day. In my book, Osman, I theorize Palestine. Let me just get a drink of water because I talk too much. In my book, I theorize Palestine. I come up with a new term I call the post-catastrophic. But the prefix post I put in parentheses. And that for a reason. I do that for a reason. Now, everything, all the writings, the thinking, the music, the poetry, the novel on Palestine that started post 1948 or post the catastrophe, yes, you have to recognize that there was a big rupture in 1948 that caused all of this creative work and armed struggle, for example, to begin. But at the same time, the reason I put the word post in parentheses, because whatever you put parenthetically, you can always remove. What do you have left? You have the catastrophic, because the catastrophic in turn within the Palestinian context continues. So it is true, we must recognize that there was a big rupture. There was a huge catastrophe in 1948 that we call the Nakba. Ilham Pepe calls the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. But the fact is the Nakba continues. Okay, it has not ended. So it's hard to forget something that you're living every day. It doesn't make sense. It's illogical.
No, it makes perfect sense. And I was thinking then, because we've obviously mentioned things like memory, but there's a few parts to this. I mean, on the one hand, it's not like Palestinians can forget because, despite what Ben Gurion's words suggest, Israel doesn't let them forget because it does still inflict a lot of violence even now on them. And so it's partly they're not allowed to forget. But I think also you could also ask the question here, is the word memory the right word? Because if, the implication of what we're saying here, of course, is that, the Nakba did not end, it's going on. So are we even in the position where we can talk of memory, or are we still witnessing it, if you understand me?
Yeah, I do understand you. And that's a really good question. Because I'm always conflicted, because a lot of people, who are writing about Palestine, they'll use the word memory and memory studies, and then they'll use the word post-memory, which I have an even bigger problem with. Post the memory, as if the memory is something, or memory is something that happened in the past, but somehow does not continue. You know what I'm saying? I do understand the importance of memory in terms of documenting what happened, what actually happened in 1948. And I think Noor Masalha does a great job in, in his books on Palestinian history, because a lot of what happened in 1948 is not really well understood, okay? Even Arabs, even Palestinians don't really understand the systematic, let's say, the systematic population transfer, or the systematic burning of villages, or the systematic massacres in different villages, or the different villages that were pinpointed where different massacres would take place. All of this was documented. And how did we learn about this? Noor Masalha, for example, researched Israeli military archives and British archives that are, in Israel, the Zionist state, they release their archives every 50 years, okay? So when these archives were released, Noor Masalha looked through these archives, and he was able to see that Zionism and Zionist ideology, the core of Zionist ideology, was population transfer. It's not like these Jewish immigrants were, escaping, and they came to a land without a people for a people without a land. You had a population there, okay? And the population, they were the indigenous people of the land. So the core of Zionist ideology is population transfer. You are removing a people to bring in another people, okay? So I think in terms of memory, if we're going to go back to the word memory, yeah, this is very important. We need to document exactly what happened. We need to look at those archives and see. Ilan Pape is another, Noor Masalha, I think his book was called The Expulsion of the Palestinians, and it was published in the 1990s. After him came Ilan Pape, and he published The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And both of them were able to document how Palestinian villages were depopulated. What exactly happened? The water was poisoned. Some villages were burned. People were massacred. And this was something that was planned. It was planned and it was systematic. So if this is part of what it means in terms of memory, yeah, then it's very important to keep this kind of memory of the past alive. But it's also equally important, if not more important, to understand that the catastrophe continues. Sometimes we tend to overlook that we have people in refugee camps who are living in miserable conditions, who really don't have, like in Lebanon, okay, they don't have like the right to own property, et cetera, okay? So these people are still waiting. They've been waiting for 75 years. The catastrophe continues, people. It's not a memory. It's not a post memory. It's a lived reality. This is what we have to understand. It's not I don't like this term post memory. A lot of people are using it today. It is not a post memory. It's a lived reality. And Palestinians are living the catastrophe every day.
Yes, it's a big because it's also a continued conversation around the use of words and their meanings, because of course people start using words not realizing, of course, it can be used in so many different ways. I mean, I always thought it was kind of interesting in the way, because with Zionist claims, they would always say, there's always been a Jewish yearning to return to Palestine and to rule it. But what's kind of interesting about that idea is that seems to be a very modern idea that, Zionists themselves have, effectively created this idea that there was always a Jewish yearning to return to this particular land.
Mhm.
And they will always pick up on the fact that, at Passover, they will say next year in Jerusalem. But this is a kind of imagined in the fictional sense, understanding of the history. And, this long yearning was never really there. It's something that they sort of came up with in the 20th century. But what's interesting to me is that in a funny kind of way, the sort of fictitious version of their history, they've actually created it as a reality for Palestinians who are genuinely seeking to return to their land. So it's a kind of a way that they've transferred a historical concept of imagination, of wanting to return, and they've created it as a reality for another people.
Absolutely, Osman. And this, what you said there, brings us to the idea of origins and beginnings.
Which is my
Okay.
next question.
Yeah, well, because that really plays into what I'm going to say here. Now, the idea of the promised land. Okay. If I can find real quickly, like a quotation by Mahmoud Darwish, again, the Palestinian poet, he says something like, and I found his quotation to be this line to be really interesting. He's talking about the Palestinians. He says, "We who have no existence in the promised land." Of course, what is he saying there? He's not saying that the Palestinians have or had no existence on the land of Palestine. But the idea of the promised land, this myth narrative, Okay, and Nur Masalha uses this word in his book, I think, The 4,000 Year History of Palestine. He calls it a myth narrative. The history of Palestine is not a myth narrative. It is not based on a mythical idea of the promised land. God promised the Jews this land 2,500 years ago. So what you have is Jews returning to the promised land after 2,500, 3,000 years. My God, are those people pure of blood? Did they stay pure of blood and genes for 2,000, 3,000 years? It's illogical. It is a mythic idea. It's a myth narrative. And Nur Masalha talks about this kind of myth and the myth narrative in the same way that Edward Said also talks about origins and beginnings. For Edward Said, he believes that history is secular, it's man made, okay? History is secular, it's man made, it's real, it's not mythic, it's not based on myth. So, yeah, I think I know I keep reading parts from my book, but there's a really popular cultural theorist from the Caribbean, but he lived in the UK, I think. He passed now. His name is Stuart Hall. And he wrote something really interesting because usually you don't think that somebody from the Caribbean would be interested in Palestine or in how Israel was created. This is what Stuart Hall has to say about the establishment of the Zionist state. He says, because you know, Jews talk about the diaspora. And when they talk about the diaspora, again, Osman, we are talking about some mythic idea of a promised land that was promised by God to the Jews. And now the Jews would be returning to this empty land, etc., etc. But let me read to you what Stuart Hall has to say. This idea of diaspora and the Jewish diaspora. Hall says the following: diaspora does not refer us to those scattered tribes whose identity can only be secured in relation to some sacred homeland to which they must at all costs return, even if it means pushing other people into the sea. This is the old, the imperializing, the hegemonizing form of ethnicity. We have seen the fate of the people of Palestine at the hands of this backward looking conception of diaspora and the complicity of the West with it. I'll stop there. So, this is the idea. And you know, the strangest thing is this kind of mythic or myth narrative of returning to some sacred promised land, as you said, Osman, is something that is being brought into our modern era, and it's being used as like you know, an argument for the right of the Jews who have returned after 3,000 years to this land. But this land had people on it. Where did those people come from? The Palestinians, the indigenous people of the land. Where did they come from? Are they not the people who over generations, hundreds, not thousands of years, and their, you know, descendants have been living on this land continuously? Who are the Palestinians that they need to be removed, displaced, so that the mythic idea of the promised land and the returnees after 2,000, 3,000 years are going to come back to this land? And the fact that, you know, the UK and with the Balfour Declaration, and even, you know, there was an article in the BBC today. They were talking about something that Mahmoud Abbas said very stupidly about, you know, the Holocaust. And, you know, but it gave the BBC somehow the right, okay, to talk about the fact that, you know, the Jews or, you know, Israelis and Palestinians have, you know, right to the land and there's a dispute there. No, sir. You're talking about, and they're talking in the BBC article, they're talking about, a right that's like thousands of years, but the Jews have been, not on the land. They've been somewhere, I don't know, all over the world, Europe, and, but now they're returning. Somehow it's been modernized, and how you can modernize and make logical something that is mythic, something promised, they say God given, the promised land to the Jews 3,000 years ago is beyond belief. How it can be brought into a modern, modernity and a modern notion of, these people's right to the land, etc. So that's what I have to say on that.
Yeah, it's because this obviously you're talking also about the concept of multiple beginnings, because I think there were sort of two aspects of it, of course. There's the idea that Palestinian history, in a sense, doesn't have a specific beginning. It has different beginnings because different things happen in Palestine. There's changes in the culture, changes in history, changes in all sorts of things. And this is what we would expect from a kind of, a natural flowing history to happen. Every country that's where you have a natural history, a natural progression occurs, they always have different beginnings. So there's no one origin point, there's multiple. But there's the second aspect of it, which is the implication for the future, which is, and Palestine will have many more beginnings to come. That's how I sort of understood what you were sort of getting at in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Nur Musalha talks about the 4,000-year history of Palestine, right? So when you're talking about a 4,000-year history, you are not talking about one origin. You have a beginning and another beginning, because people were always being affected, influenced, colonized, recolonized, shaped, reshaped, and you had different cultures always, and then you have these multiple beginnings. That's the history of Palestine. And the history of Palestine is not one pure, essential, continuous line of something that never changes. Because, previously we were talking about like 3,000, 2,000 to 3,000 years of unchanging Jewish identity, which is ridiculous. Okay, so yes, we have multiple beginnings. And we begin, and then we begin again. And this is also an idea by Edward Said. He had, in 1975, he published a book called Beginnings. That's the title of the book, Beginnings, Intention and Method. And it was precisely that. He differentiated between origins, which are given, and there's nothing you can do about origins. They're given. It's like filiation. Okay, blood, tribe, name, you're just born into something. And beginnings. Now, with beginnings, there's human agency and there's empowerment. You decide to do something, you decide to begin. And beginnings, somehow, if you think about it, Osman, it's related to imagining as well. Beginnings and imagining and inventing, etc. So beginnings, they come with human intention, and that's from the title of Edward Said's book, Beginnings, Intention and Method. Human intention, meaning human agency, meaning you have the power to act. It's not something you are given, okay? No, it is something that you create. It is something that you make, and that is empowering. And again, that's another level of, or if you want, of imagining. So yes, beginnings, then multiple beginnings. That's the history of Palestine, and it's secular, it's historical, it's intentional, and it allows human agency. We choose our beginnings, and we can always begin again. So yeah, that's a very important idea, and I think it's related, it's connected to even the argument of, imagining in my book. Let me see. Yeah, that's what I want to say there.
Yes. So sort of moving forward now, where are we today with, Palestinian imaginings? I mean, obviously in the book, we talk a lot about the development of the Palestinian imagination in the ways we just described over the many decades. Where
Mm.
are we today with it though?
I think that we are at a very important, let's say, crossroads point in Palestinian history. And we were talking about the young not forgetting. Not only are the young not forgetting, Rasman, but they are becoming fiercer. They're becoming more defiant. They're becoming more resistant than even their parents and grandparents ever were. Maybe their grandparents, when Palestine was first lost, okay, a lot of the reaction was sentimental, okay, emotional, nostalgic, right? Oh, I want to go back to my old home. I want to see. So there was a lot of nostalgia. Now, with this new generation, and Ghassan Kanafani writes about the new generation of Palestinians in his returning to Haifa. With this new generation, you don't see sentimentality or nostalgia. You see people who understand the past, they understand their present, and they're looking towards a future where they can actually imagine victory, imagine liberation. Okay. When you see these young people, I mean, they go out knowing that they can be martyred at any moment. They leave the house that they know that today that she will become a martyr. Okay. These people are fearless. They don't fear death. Okay. It is a kind of living in sumud. This kind of steadfastness has become a part of their genetic coding. And I think this is something that the Zionist state must really fear. And they feel it, they know it, okay? They don't understand Palestinian Sumud. I call it, in my book, Palestinian Sumud, because I feel that the Palestinian people have given even a new dimension, a new meaning to it, a sumud that is even more than sumud. Okay, so what is the future? What do I see? With this kind of generation, this kind of thinking, this kind of defiance, can only lead to one thing. Okay, one road, one path, and that is the path to liberation. Okay, because the revolution is real, it is happening, it is spreading. And also, let me mention, we have international solidarity now, okay? Something like we've never seen before. Go, go to the campuses in the United States, university campuses in the UK, in Europe, all over the world. You find young people, okay, who are fighting for Palestine, protesting for Palestine. And you hear the slogan a lot these days: Palestine will be free, from the river to the sea. You hear it in Chicago, in New York, in London, everywhere. So, with this kind of international solidarity and the kind of resilience of the Palestinian people, it can only mean one thing and one thing alone: that liberation and the total liberation of Palestine is coming, is nearing, and it will happen, despite what defeatist Arab regimes and the PA may say or may think. Because I think, that is going to be old news pushed aside. It's not going to dominate. What we see, the young people, their daring, their defiance, their resilience is unstoppable. And I do believe that the Zionist state fears this kind of Palestinian resistance and this kind of Palestinian sumud. Um, the region, I feel the Arab region, regionally, um, Palestine and the Palestinian cause deserves more from Arab countries. And because the Arab peoples all over the Arab world, they They support Palestine. It's the one just cause in their mind. They give it unwavering support, and Arab regimes must make note of that.
So, because we also talked about this new generation, the fears of the Zionist regime and that kind of thing. I'm also wondering then, is this also the fear of the PA itself? Because of course, the implication of what you're saying would be them out of power, effectively.
Absolutely, Osman. Because the PA, as you know, has security arrangements with the Zionist state, right? So the PA is obviously not supportive of resistance, and they try in every way to crush resistance. They cooperate with the Zionist state by giving names, telling them where and so is hiding, where he is. So this kind, you cannot be cooperating with the enemy and then presume that you're going to continue to exist in this way, because your people will not accept that. Okay, the Palestinian people want their freedom. They want to be liberated. They do not want to be occupied. They want to live like any other people in this world. Okay, so the PA does not represent the Palestinian people. And this is something we need to be very, very clear about. Okay, this kind of authority, this kind of cooperation with the enemy cannot represent a people who has been the Palestinian people have been struggling for 75 years. And the PA, this kind of authority cannot represent the Palestinian people under any circumstance. So this kind of fear that the Zionist state has, Israel has, is also felt by the PA, and they should feel it.
Hamidi, thank you for talking to us at Memo Conversations.
Thank you very much, Osman. Before I go, I know it's been a little bit too long. Can I just read the final paragraph in my book, if you allow me, please?
It'd make an excellent closing. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. When I was writing this book, a lot of important people passed away. Some of them from my own family. Others were poets that I wrote about in the book. And this is sort of like a tribute to them, Osman, if you allow me. I say the following. During the writing of this book, many Palestinians in blood and heart, who are an integral part of the Palestinian narrative and revolution, which is still being written, passed from this life before fulfilling their dream of return. I name some of them here. To quote the Irish poet William Butler Yeats, to murmur name upon name as a mother names her child. My father, Khalil Ismail Hamdi, one of the founders of the Arab nationalist movement and the armed struggle for the liberation of Palestine. My brother, Hamdi Khalil Hamdi, the scientist who rooted his science in the very nature of Palestine. The two great Palestinian poets, Mourid Barghouti, who sang of Palestine's repeated historical pain, and Izz al-Din al-Manasra, whose only wish was not to sleep in a grave in exile. The fearless professor and oppositional intellectual who spoke truth to power, Abdel Sattar Qasim, and who wanted to take part in this conversation, but left us before he could. And Anis al-Naqash, the great Lebanese revolutionary, who was every bit a Palestinian, and when he knew of the imminence of his own death, wrote, "My life is done, but the Palestinian narrative has not ended. To all the martyrs of Palestine, we promise you to continue the struggle until there's a collective return to Palestine that would truly enable the Palestinian people to finally realize their genuine liberation." Tahrir.
Thank you for that lovely reading. I think that's a nice way to bring this conversation to a close. I'd like to thank you again for talking to us.
Thank you, Osman.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you would like to watch this episode or previous episodes, you can go to our website, but please do join in next time for more Memo Conversations.